The motorcycle was supposed to stay buried forever. For 27 years, three friends kept the perfect lie until a construction crew in Utah dug up more than just Daniel's bike. What they found hidden inside the gas tank contained 47 seconds of footage that would unravel nearly 3 decades of deception. But before we get to that earth-shattering discovery that would destroy 3 lives and finally bring justice to Daniel Cross, we need to understand who Daniel was and why his disappearance should have been impossible for anyone who truly knew him. Daniel Cross wasn't just another weekend warrior with a motorcycle and a dream. At 29, he was the beating heart of a brotherhood that had lasted since high school. For over 8 years, Daniel had been the organizer, the planner, the one who turned three guys' shared love of motorcycles into something deeper, an annual pilgrimage that defined their friendship. Every summer since 1990, Daniel would spend months planning their route. California's coastal highways, Nevada's desert straightaways, Utah's winding mountain passes, he knew every mile, every gas station, every scenic overlook worth stopping for. But it wasn't just about the riding. Daniel had an almost spiritual connection to these journeys. Daniel lived by a code that seemed almost old-fashioned in 1998. Your word was your bond. You never left a friend behind. You faced problems head-on instead of running away. And most importantly, you always took care of your brothers. His apartment was filled with photos from their annual trips. Three friends grinning beside their bikes, arms around each other's shoulders, the open road stretching endlessly behind them. To Daniel, these weren't just vacation pictures. They were proof that real friendship could survive anything. That unwavering loyalty would ultimately cost Daniel Cross his life. Now, I know what you're thinking. How does a story about three friends on a motorcycle trip end with a 27-year cover-up? How does hidden footage recorded in 1998 suddenly surface in 2025? And most importantly, what was so damning about those 47 seconds that it would send two middle-aged men to prison for the rest of their lives? Stay with me, because the answers will leave you questioning everything you think you know about loyalty, friendship, and how far people will go to protect themselves when their backs are against the wall. Let me take you back to 1998 and introduce you to Daniel Cross, a man whose story would remain buried for 27 years before finally seeing the light of justice. At 29 years old, Daniel wasn't just another weekend warrior with a shiny motorcycle and too much disposable income burning a hole in his pocket. He was absolutely and completely the heart and soul of a brotherhood that had not only survived everything life could throw at it, but had actually grown stronger through every challenge they'd faced together. While his two closest friends struggled with failing businesses, mounting debts, and the crushing weight of financial problems that seemed to have no solutions, Daniel had found remarkable success as a software consultant during the unprecedented boom of the late 1990s dot-com explosion. His expertise was in high demand, his client list was growing exponentially, and money was flowing in faster than he could spend it. But here's what made Daniel Cross a truly special. What set him apart from so many people who find sudden financial success, that money hadn't changed him one bit. He still lived by an old-fashioned moral code that seems almost quaint and naive by today's cynical standards. Your word was your sacred bond that could never be broken. You never, under any circumstances, abandoned a friend who needed you. You faced your problems head-on with courage and integrity instead of running away like a coward. And most importantly, most fundamentally, you always took care of your brothers, no matter what the cost to yourself. Daniel's modest apartment was like a shrine to their friendship, a testament to the power of genuine human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. Photographs from 8 years of annual motorcycle trips covered virtually every surface. Three friends grinning broadly beside their gleaming bikes, arms draped over each other's shoulders in easy camaraderie. The endless American highway stretching behind them like a ribbon of infinite possibility and eternal adventure. These weren't just vacation snapshots collecting dust in photo albums. To Daniel, these images represented something far more profound and meaningful. They were tangible proof that real friendship, authentic human connection, could survive and thrive in a world that seemed increasingly focused on individual success at the expense of genuine relationships. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, The absolute betrayal that would define the rest of this story? You need to know about the other two members of this supposedly unbreakable brotherhood. There was Marcus Webb, Daniel's best friend since their elementary school days, a relationship that spanned over 2 decades of shared experiences, secrets, and unwavering mutual support. Marcus had always been the most ambitious of the three, the one with the biggest dreams and the most aggressive plans for financial success. He'd thrown himself into real estate with the kind of determination that should have guaranteed success. But 1998 was proving to be a brutal year for the housing market, and Marcus was watching his carefully constructed career crumble before his eyes. 3 months had passed without a single sale. Bills were piling up like autumn leaves, and the constant stress of impending financial failure was eating away at his confidence, his self-worth, and his ability to think clearly about anything else. Then there was Jake Morrison, the group's designated mechanic and unofficial bike doctor, a man who could work magic with anything that had wheels and an engine. Jake possessed the kind of intuitive mechanical knowledge that can't be taught in schools. He could diagnose problems by sound, fix complex issues with improvised tools, and keep their motorcycles running smoothly through thousands of miles of challenging terrain. But mechanical genius doesn't automatically translate to business success, and Jake was discovering this harsh reality in the most painful way possible. His auto shop, which should have been thriving in a world increasingly dependent on automobiles, was instead hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Bankruptcy wasn't just a distant possibility, it was staring him directly in the face, and every day brought new reminders of his failure to transform his incredible skills into financial stability. But I haven't told you about the third member yet, the one whose particular obsession and compulsive behavior would ultimately expose their crime nearly 3 decades later and bring justice to a man who died believing in the power of friendship. Brett Harrison was the quiet observer of the group, the one who always seemed to be watching life unfold through the lens of his expensive video camera, rather than fully participating in the moments he was so carefully documenting. In 1998, long before digital cameras became commonplace and everyone carried a video recorder in their pocket, Brett was one of the few people who owned professional-grade recording equipment and brought it absolutely everywhere they went. His compulsion to document every moment, every conversation, every experience was so complete, so all-consuming, that his friends had long since stopped noticing the ever-present camera. Brett's obsession with filming their adventures, his need to capture and preserve every detail of their friendship, would prove to be the crucial detail that none of them considered when they made their deadly decision that night in the Utah wilderness. Sometimes, in the most ironic twist of fate, the very thing we think protects us, the behavior we believe keeps us safe, becomes the weapon that ultimately destroys us completely. The summer of 1998 started exactly like the 8 summers that had come before it, with Daniel spending months of meticulous preparation, coordinating everyone's schedules, mapping out routes through the most scenic parts of the American West, and making reservations at all their favorite stops along the way. By July 18th, they'd already covered nearly 700 miles of perfect riding weather, hitting all their traditional landmarks, sharing meals and creating memories exactly as they had for years. But something was fundamentally different that summer, something that even Daniel's infectious enthusiasm and natural leadership couldn't completely mask or overcome. The economic pressures weighing heavily on both Marcus and Jake had created an undercurrent of tension, resentment, and barely controlled frustration that seemed to follow them like a dark cloud, despite the beautiful weather and stunning scenery surrounding them. Still, as they made camp that evening in their absolute favorite spot, a remote area of the Wasatch Mountains, completely isolated from civilization, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the star-filled sky, with a crystal-clear mountain stream running nearby. Everything appeared normal on the surface. Daniel was completely in his element that evening, displaying all the qualities that had made him the natural leader of their group for so many years. He'd built their campfire with his characteristic precision and attention to detail, organized their camping gear with almost military efficiency, and was already enthusiastically planning the next day's route through some of Utah's most spectacular and challenging canyon country. Brett, following his usual pattern, had his professional-grade video camera running almost constantly, capturing what he fully expected would be another collection of happy memories to add to their extensive 8-year archive of friendship and adventure. None of them had any idea that they were about to create footage that would remain hidden for 27 years before ultimately exposing one of the most calculated and heartless crimes in Utah's history. Around 9 p.m., as darkness settled over the mountains like a comfortable blanket and the temperature dropped to the perfect level for sitting around a campfire, they broke out the alcohol and settled in for what should have been another night of their sacred tradition, sharing stories from their past, gently roasting each other with the kind of good-natured ribbing that only comes from decades of friendship, and strengthening bonds that had already lasted over a decade and seemed absolutely unbreakable. But what none of them realized in that moment, what they couldn't possibly have foreseen as they sat beneath the vast Utah sky, was that those bonds they trusted so completely were about to be tested in a way that would reveal the true character of each man and destroy their friendship forever. Here's where this story takes a dark turn that will make you reconsider everything you think you know about human nature, about the people we trust most, and about how quickly even the strongest relationships can turn deadly when the wrong combination of factors comes together at exactly the wrong moment. The conversation that would ultimately lead to Daniel Cross's death started innocently enough, the way so many tragedies begin, with friends simply talking about their lives, their struggles, their hopes and fears. Marcus began venting about his increasingly desperate money troubles, describing in detail the brutal state of the real estate market, the humiliation of 3 months without a single sale, and the constant, crushing stress of watching his carefully planned career dissolve before his eyes. Jake chimed in with his own litany of financial disasters, painting a vivid picture of his auto shop's steady decline toward bankruptcy, the mounting bills he couldn't pay, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong, despite his incredible mechanical skills and tireless work ethic. As the night wore on and the alcohol began to flow more freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions, something truly poisonous began to emerge from the depths of their friendship. Both Marcus and Jake started focusing their attention, their frustration, and their barely contained anger on Daniel's relative financial success and the ease with which money seemed to flow into his life. His thriving software consulting business, which was riding the wave of the dot-com boom to unprecedented heights, suddenly became a source of resentment rather than something to celebrate. His expensive new motorcycle, which he'd purchased specifically to enhance their shared adventures, was now viewed as a symbol of his financial superiority. His casual attitude toward money, the way he never seemed to worry about expenses or count every dollar, became evidence of his supposed arrogance and lack of understanding about their struggles. What began as friends simply venting about temporary tough times slowly and insidiously transformed into something much more sinister and dangerous. Comments about Daniel, not understanding real struggle, started flying with increasing frequency and venom. Jokes that weren't really jokes about him throwing money around, while they could barely make rent, began to dominate the conversation. The kind of deep-seated resentment that can simmer beneath the surface of relationships for years, hidden and unacknowledged, was finally erupting in the most destructive way possible. Daniel, with his characteristic emotional intelligence and genuine care for his friends, immediately sensed the dangerous shift in mood and tried to do what he had always done throughout their friendship: fix the problem and restore harmony to their group. He offered to loan them substantial amounts of money with no interest and no specific repayment schedule. He suggested they could start a business together, combining his financial resources with their skills and expertise. He reminded them, with growing desperation, that financial success had never changed how he felt about their friendship, that money was just money and could never compare to the value of their brotherhood. But his attempts at generosity, his sincere desire to help them through their difficult times, only made the situation worse by highlighting the very financial disparity that was causing their resentment in the first place. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus said, his voice thick with alcohol and years of carefully hidden jealousy that was finally spilling out into the open. "You think you can just solve everything with your money? You think you're better than us, that we're just your charity cases?" "Come on, man," Daniel replied, his voice still patient and reasonable despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere, still trying to diffuse the situation with the kind of understanding that had made him such a good friend for so many years. You know that's not true. You know I've never thought that. We're brothers. Brothers? Jake laughed with a bitterness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark within him. Brothers don't make the rest of us feel like pathetic losers every time we hang out. Brothers don't parade their success around like some kind of trophy. And that's when years of suppressed resentment, hidden jealousy, and carefully buried anger came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Accusations that had been festering in the dark corners of their minds for months or even years suddenly filled the mountain air with a toxicity that seemed to poison everything it touched. Claims that Daniel was condescending and superior, that he looked down on their blue-collar struggles from his ivory tower of software success, that he treated their friendship like an expensive hobby he could afford while they scraped together money just to participate in their annual adventures. Every generous gesture he'd ever made was reinterpreted as evidence of his arrogance. Every offer of help was seen as proof that he viewed them as inferior. Daniel tried desperately to defend himself, to explain with increasing urgency that his success had never changed how he felt about them, that their friendship was honestly and truly the most important thing in his life, more valuable than any amount of money or professional achievement. But two drunk men, fueled by years of economic frustration and wounded pride, had found the perfect target for all their rage and disappointment, and nothing Daniel said could stop the avalanche of anger that was building toward an inevitable and tragic climax. The argument escalated with frightening speed, voices rising above the crackling of the campfire, harsh words echoing off the surrounding mountains. Years of friendship were being systematically destroyed by alcohol, jealousy, and the kind of bitter resentment that can turn even the closest friends into enemies in a matter of minutes. The physical confrontation began when Marcus, his judgment completely clouded by alcohol and rage, shoved Daniel backward with both hands, putting significant force behind the action that sent Daniel stumbling away from the fire. Now here's what's absolutely crucial to understand about Daniel Cross's character. What made his death so particularly tragic and senseless. Even as his closest friends turned on him with inexplicable viciousness, even as years of hidden resentment exploded in his face like a bomb, Daniel remained true to his peaceful nature and moral code. Instead of responding with violence, instead of fighting back against the men who were attacking him both verbally and physically, Daniel put his hands up in a clear gesture of peace and surrender. "We don't need to do this," he said, his voice still remarkably calm despite the chaos erupting around him. "Let's just sleep it off and talk in the morning when we can think clearly." But Jake Morrison, his mechanical hands now clenched into fists, fueled by years of financial frustration, wounded pride, and the kind of alcohol-induced rage that makes people do things they never thought themselves capable of, grabbed Daniel by his shirt with both hands and shoved him with all the strength and fury he'd been holding inside for months. What happened next would haunt two men for the rest of their lives. And it's the exact moment that 47 seconds of hidden footage would eventually expose to the world with crystal clarity, bringing justice to a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Daniel staggered backward from Jake's violent shove, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance, his foot catching on a loose rock near the edge of their carefully chosen campsite. The beautiful location they'd selected for that night, positioned on a slight ridge overlooking a steep, rocky ravine that dropped away into darkness, became a death trap in that crucial moment when balance and sure footing meant the difference between life and death. Daniel fell hard, his body tumbling helplessly down the rocky slope like a rag doll, bouncing off boulders and scraping against jagged outcroppings before finally striking his head with tremendous force against a massive granite formation about 15 feet below their campsite. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud, echoing through the mountains like a gunshot and immediately cutting through the alcohol haze that had clouded Marcus and Jake's judgment. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, time itself appeared to stop. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody spoke. The only sounds in the vast wilderness were the innocent crackling of their campfire above, and Daniel's increasingly labored and irregular breathing from the ravine below. each breath a reminder that their friend was dying while they stood frozen in shock and horror. Then Jake, despite his rage and the alcohol coursing through his system, despite the argument that had just torn their friendship apart, immediately scrambled down the treacherous slope to check on Daniel, his mechanical instincts taking over as he tried to assess the damage and figure out what could be done to help. "He's hurt bad," Jake called up to Marcus, his voice shaking with the sudden, terrible realization of what their stupid argument had caused. "Really, really bad. We need to get him to a hospital right now, immediately, or he's going to die." Daniel was still conscious but clearly suffering from a severe traumatic brain injury that was far beyond anything they could handle in the wilderness. He was disoriented and confused, having trouble speaking coherently, and blood was pooling steadily beneath his head, creating a dark stain on the rocky ground that grew larger with each passing minute. In a city surrounded by the infrastructure of modern emergency medicine, this would have been a tragic accident with a genuine chance for recovery. Paramedics would have arrived within minutes, Daniel would have been rushed to a trauma center, and skilled neurosurgeons would have fought to save his life. But they were 50 miles from the nearest town, with no cell phone coverage, no way to call for help, and Daniel was fading fast as precious minutes ticked away. "What do we do?" Brett whispered from above, his professional video camera still running and recording everything, preserving evidence that wouldn't surface for 27 years, but would ultimately become the key to solving Daniel's murder. That's when Marcus Webb made the decision that would define the rest of their lives, a decision so cold, calculating, and fundamentally evil that it would shock a jury nearly 3 decades later and reveal the true depths of human selfishness and cowardice. "We can't take him to a hospital," Marcus said with chilling clarity, his real estate agent's mind already working through the potential consequences and calculating the risk to his own future. "We'll all go to prison. They'll say we murdered him." "But he needs help desperately," Jake protested from the ravine, cradling Daniel's head in his hands, watching the life slowly drain from his friend's eyes. "If we don't get him medical attention immediately, he's going to die right here." "He's going to die anyway," Marcus replied with a coldness that was absolutely breathtaking in its complete lack of humanity. "Look at him. Even if we could somehow get him to a hospital in time, which we can't, we'd all be facing serious assault charges at minimum. Probably manslaughter. Our lives would be completely over." Can you imagine the horror of that moment? Can you picture two men standing in the Utah wilderness, watching their friend die slowly and painfully, while debating whether saving his life was worth the potential risk to their own futures? It was a moment that revealed the true character of each man with absolute clarity, and what it revealed was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. For nearly 20 minutes, as Daniel Cross lay dying in a rocky ravine, his two closest friends had a detailed discussion about whether his life was worth saving. They weighed the pros and cons like it was a business decision. They calculated the legal risks like accountants preparing a tax return. They discussed their own futures, their own families, their own careers, while the man who had organized 8 years of friendship adventures slowly bled to death just a few feet away. Daniel Cross died at 11:23 p.m. on July 18, 1998, with Jake Morrison holding his hand and whispering empty apologies, while Marcus Webb stood above them, calculating legal consequences and planning their cover-up. And despite having nearly an hour to save his life, despite being physically capable of carrying him to their truck and driving toward help, neither of them made any real attempt to save their friend. But the story doesn't end with Daniel's tragic and senseless death. What came next was a cover-up so methodical, so carefully planned, and so utterly heartless that it would have impressed professional criminals and demonstrate a level of cold calculation that seemed impossible to reconcile with their previous images as ordinary, decent men. Marcus, his business mind now operating at full capacity, despite the alcohol and trauma of the situation, immediately began planning their strategy with the kind of systematic thinking that had made him successful in real estate. Every detail had to be considered, every possible question anticipated, every piece of evidence carefully managed or eliminated. They couldn't simply leave Daniel's body in the ravine and claim he died in an accident. Too many questions would be asked about the circumstances leading to his fall, about the argument that had preceded it, about their own behavior and potential culpability. They couldn't report him missing from their campsite. Their own presence at the scene would automatically make them suspects, and any investigation would quickly reveal the inconsistencies in their story. We have to make it look like he left on his own, Marcus decided with terrifying clarity and attention to detail. We pack up all his stuff, take his bike, bury everything where nobody will ever find it. As far as the world knows, Daniel Cross left our campsite on his own motorcycle and disappeared into the wilderness. Brett Harrison, still clutching his video camera, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, spoke the words that would seal their conspiracy and set in motion a deception that would last for 27 years. What about the footage? I've been recording all night. Everything is on tape. Delete it, Marcus ordered without a moment's hesitation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already thought through every possible complication. All of it. All of it? Brett asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Even the good stuff from earlier? Everything from tonight. We were never here. Daniel left early this morning before any of us woke up, said he had somewhere to be, someone to meet. That's our story, and we stick to it no matter what anyone asks, no matter how much pressure they put on us. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that would ultimately bring justice to Daniel Cross 27 years later, proving that sometimes the very actions we take to protect ourselves become the instruments of our destruction. Brett Harrison made a split-second decision that would change everything and eventually expose their crime to the world. Instead of deleting the footage, as Marcus had ordered, Brett quickly and quietly removed the memory tape from his camera and made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. He hid the tape in the one place he knew nobody would think to look, the one location that would keep the evidence safe even if their entire cover-up plan fell apart inside Daniel's motorcycle gas tank. That single act of preservation, driven by some combination of guilt, fear, and perhaps a subconscious desire for eventual justice, would become the key to solving Daniel's murder nearly 3 decades later. But first, they had to complete their horrific cover-up and transform themselves from 3 friends on a camping trip into accomplices in one of the most calculated murders in Utah history. The burial process took them the entire night, and the methodical, systematic nature of their work reveals just how completely their crime had transformed them from grieving friends into cold-blooded killers focused solely on self-preservation. Using tools from Jake's truck, shovels, picks, and other equipment they'd brought for routine campsite maintenance, they carried Daniel's body up from the ravine where he'd died and transported it deep into the forest, miles from any established trail or road where hikers or hunters might accidentally discover it. The grave they dug was deep and carefully concealed, hidden beneath layers of forest debris that would quickly be covered by natural growth and seasonal changes. Daniel's body went in first, wrapped in tarps and sleeping bags like discarded camping equipment, rather than the remains of a man who had loved and trusted them completely. Then came the truly chilling part of their cover-up, the detail that demonstrated just how calculated and thorough their crime had become. They systematically disassembled Daniel's expensive motorcycle piece by piece, using Jake's mechanical expertise to break it down into components that could be buried separately around the main gravesite. The engine went into one hole, the frame into another. Chrome components, wheels, handlebars, and every other identifiable part was buried in a different location, creating a scattered field of evidence that would be virtually impossible to discover accidentally. By dawn, all physical evidence of Daniel Cross's presence had been systematically and completely erased from the earth. But their cover-up went even further than just hiding the body in the motorcycle. Daniel's camping gear was carefully divided between Marcus and Jake, and would later be disposed of in dumpsters across 2 different states, ensuring that no single piece of evidence could be traced back to their campsite. His personal belongings, wallet, watch, jewelry, anything that could identify him, were gathered up and would be burned in Jake's auto shop furnace within days of their return home. His motorcycle registration, insurance papers, and any other documents that could connect him to the bike were destroyed completely. They even went through his camping gear and removed every single item that had his name or initials on it, every piece of clothing, every personal item that could somehow be connected to him if it was ever found. When they finally drove away from that remote Utah campsite as the sun rose on July 19th, 1998, they had transformed a crime scene into pristine wilderness. Every trace of Daniel Cross had been systematically eliminated, and they were about to begin living a lie that would last for more than a quarter century. When they returned home to their normal lives, they implemented the final phase of Marcus's carefully constructed deception. They reported Daniel missing exactly as they had planned, with a story that was simple, consistent, and impossible to disprove. Daniel had left their campsite early in the morning, they told police. He'd seemed distracted and troubled about some personal problems he wouldn't discuss in detail. He'd mentioned something vague about meeting someone, about having something important to take care of, but he hadn't provided any specifics. The lie was absolutely perfect in its simplicity and consistency. They had rehearsed it during their long drive home, anticipating every possible question, preparing for every conceivable challenge to their story. Two men who had just committed murder swore to maintain their deception forever, and their performance was so convincing that even experienced investigators found no reason to doubt their account. The investigation into Daniel Cross's disappearance was thorough, professional, and ultimately completely fruitless through no fault of the investigators involved. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned professional with years of experience in missing persons cases, interviewed both friends multiple times over several months, but their stories never varied by even the smallest detail. They seemed genuinely concerned about Daniel's welfare, appropriately confused and worried about why their reliable, responsible friend would simply vanish without a word to anyone. Their cooperation with the investigation was complete, and seemingly eager they provided phone records, submitted to polygraph tests, and answered every question with apparent honesty and transparency. Daniel's family, his devastated parents and younger sister Rachel, were completely heartbroken but had no reason whatsoever to suspect foul play. Daniel had always been somewhat independent and occasionally impulsive in his decision-making. While it would have been completely out of character for him to abandon his family and friends without explanation, the alternative that his closest friends had murdered him was simply unthinkable. After 8 months of intensive investigation that yielded absolutely no evidence of criminal activity, no signs of violence, and no indication that Daniel had met with foul play, Daniel Cross was officially classified as a missing person who had most likely chosen to disappear voluntarily. The case remained technically open but inactive, joining thousands of similar files in law enforcement databases across the country, where people simply vanish without explanation. Meanwhile, two murderers returned to their normal lives and began building successful careers and families on the foundation of their terrible secret, while a third accomplice carried the weight of hidden evidence that would eventually destroy them all. Marcus Webb eventually found tremendous success in real estate during the unprecedented boom of the early 2000s. His natural sales ability, combined with a housing market that seemed to grow endlessly, made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams from 1998. He married his longtime girlfriend in a beautiful ceremony that Daniel should have attended as best man, had 3 children who grew up never knowing their father was a murderer, and became a respected and influential member of his community. He coached Little League Baseball with patience and dedication, served on the school board with apparent integrity, and was widely known as a family man you could trust completely with your most important business decisions. His real estate office employed dozens of people, and his reputation for honesty and reliability made him one of the most successful agents in his entire region. Jake Morrison sold his failing auto shop within a year of Daniel's murder and used the money to move to Nevada, where he eventually became a highly successful truck mechanic specializing in long-haul vehicles. His mechanical genius, no longer hampered by the stress of running a failing business, flourished in his new environment. He eventually opened a much larger garage that employed 12 full-time mechanics and served trucking companies throughout the Southwest. He sponsored local sports teams, contributed generously to community charities, and was considered a pillar of his adopted community. His customers trusted him completely, knowing that his work was always honest, reliable, and fairly priced. Brett Harrison's video production business grew steadily through the rise of digital media and the increasing demand for professional video services. He documented countless weddings, corporate events, and local news stories, building a reputation as someone who could capture the truth in any situation with artistic skill and journalistic integrity. The irony of his career choice, a man who had hidden evidence of murder becoming known for his ability to reveal truth through video, would be completely lost on him until the day of his arrest 27 years later. His clients trusted him to preserve their most precious memories, never knowing that he had helped cover up the most heinous crime imaginable. For 27 long years, the secret remained buried with Daniel Cross in the Utah mountains. The three men rarely spoke to each other anymore. The weight of their shared guilt had destroyed their friendship as surely as it had destroyed Daniel's life. But they maintained their silence with religious devotion, each knowing that speaking the truth would destroy not just their own lives, but the lives of their innocent families who had built their entire existence around men they believed to be decent and honorable. But secrets, like buried bodies, have a way of eventually coming to the surface, especially in an age of advancing technology and expanding development. And sometimes justice arrives through the most unexpected and ironic channels imaginable. In early 2025, a Denver-based development company with an impeccable reputation for environmental responsibility purchased 3,000 acres of pristine Utah mountain land with ambitious plans to create an exclusive eco-resort community that would serve wealthy clients seeking luxury accommodations in harmony with the natural environment. The project was extraordinarily ambitious and environmentally conscious. Sustainable luxury homes built with recycled materials, hiking trails that followed natural contours without disturbing wildlife, and recreational facilities powered entirely by solar and wind energy. Every aspect of the development was designed to work in perfect harmony with the existing ecosystem. But before any construction could begin, extensive environmental impact studies, detailed geological surveys, and comprehensive archaeological assessments all had to be completed to ensure that no environmental damage would occur and no historical or cultural sites would be disturbed by the development. That's how Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old archaeological contractor with a PhD from the University of Utah and a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession, came to be methodically exploring the remote forest where Daniel Cross had been buried 27 years earlier, using equipment that didn't exist when his murder occurred. Jennifer's specific job was to ensure that no Native American artifacts, historical sites, or archaeological treasures would be disturbed by the resort construction. Using ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and other high-tech equipment that could see deep beneath the surface of the earth, she systematically surveyed every square foot of the area that would eventually become the resort's main hiking trail network. On March 22, 2025, almost exactly 27 years after Daniel's murder, Jennifer's sophisticated equipment detected significant metallic objects buried approximately 7 feet underground in what appeared to be a carefully excavated and deliberately concealed area. The initial assumptions were completely logical and innocent. The metal signatures probably indicated old mining equipment, abandoned machinery, or other industrial debris left behind by previous land users. The area had a documented history of small-scale mining operations dating back to the early 1900s, so finding buried metal objects wasn't particularly unusual or suspicious. But when the careful excavation began under Jennifer's supervision, what emerged from the earth would reopen one of Utah's most puzzling and long-standing missing person cases and finally bring justice to a man who had been waiting 27 years for the truth to surface. The first item recovered was a motorcycle fuel tank, still bearing distinct traces of its original metallic blue paint, despite nearly 3 decades of burial in the harsh mountain environment. The tank was clearly from a high-end motorcycle, the kind of expensive machine that serious enthusiasts saved for years to afford. Then came the engine components, pistons, cylinders, and crankshaft pieces that had been carefully separated and buried in different locations. Chrome components followed, along with wheels, handlebars, brake assemblies, and frame pieces, all clearly from what had once been a beautiful, expensive motorcycle that had been systematically disassembled and hidden with almost surgical precision. The discovery was puzzling and increasingly suspicious. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to bury a valuable motorcycle in pieces in such a remote location? Why use such a systematic approach, separating components and burying them in different spots? And most mysteriously, why hide everything so far from any road or trail where normal dumping would be much easier. But it was what Jennifer found carefully hidden inside the motorcycle's fuel tank that would change everything and finally bring justice to Daniel Cross after more than a quarter century of silence. The videotape had been protected with extraordinary care and foresight. Brett Harrison's decision to preserve the evidence had been methodical and thorough. He'd wrapped the tape in multiple layers of plastic, sealed it inside a completely waterproof container, and then hidden it in the most secure location he could imagine, deep inside the motorcycle's gas tank, where it would remain undisturbed until someone specifically dismantled the bike. 27 years of burial in the harsh Utah mountain environment, through countless seasons of snow, rain, freezing temperatures, and scorching summer heat, hadn't significantly damaged the tape. Modern digital transfer techniques, technology that didn't exist in 1998, were able to extract virtually all of the recorded footage with crystal clear quality that preserved every word, every sound, every crucial detail of that fatal night. What investigators found on that tape was exactly 47 seconds of footage that revealed the complete, unvarnished truth about Daniel Cross's final moments and the calculated decision that followed. The video showed everything with devastating clarity. The escalating argument around the campfire, voices rising in anger and accusation, the physical confrontation that turned friends into enemies, Daniel's fatal fall down the rocky ravine, and most damning of all, the cold-blooded conversation afterward, where two men calmly decided to let their friend die rather than risk any consequences to themselves. "We can't take him to a hospital." Marcus Webb's voice was clearly audible on the recording, his words preserved with perfect clarity despite the passage of nearly 3 decades. "We'll all go to prison. They'll say we murdered him." The audio quality was so good that investigators could hear Daniel's labored breathing in the background, could hear the desperate tone in Jake's voice as he pleaded for them to get help, could hear the absolute coldness in Marcus's voice as he outlined their options with the detached calculation of a business meeting. Brett Harrison's decision to hide the videotape instead of destroying it as ordered had preserved the smoking gun evidence needed to solve a 27-year-old murder case. In his attempt to protect himself while maintaining some vestige of conscience, he had ultimately ensured that justice would eventually prevail, even if it took nearly 3 decades to emerge from the Utah wilderness. The arrest came with the swift, coordinated precision of a military operation, executed simultaneously across 2 states by federal authorities who wanted to prevent any possibility of the suspects fleeing, communicating with each other, or destroying additional evidence that might still exist after all these years. Marcus Webb was taken into custody at his prestigious real estate office on a busy Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a closing meeting with excited first-time homebuyers who watched in complete shock and disbelief as FBI agents led their trusted, respected realtor away in handcuffs. His perfectly organized office, filled with family photos and community service awards, became a crime scene as investigators searched for any additional evidence connected to Daniel's murder. Jake Morrison was arrested at his successful truck repair facility in Nevada, his hands still covered in motor oil from working on a customer's vehicle. His employees absolutely stunned as their respected boss was charged with a murder that had occurred before some of them were even born. The man they'd known as honest, hardworking, and completely trustworthy was suddenly revealed to be a killer who had hidden his crime for 27 years. Brett Harrison, the videographer whose own hidden camera had ultimately preserved the evidence that would destroy them all, was arrested at his professional production studio while editing footage for a young couple's wedding video. The final crushing irony of his situation, a man known for capturing truth and preserving precious memories being arrested for helping to cover up murder, was not lost on anyone involved in the case. All 3 men were charged with second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The charges were federal because Daniel's body had been transported across state lines during their cover-up, and the evidence against them was so overwhelming, so absolutely undeniable, that even the most skilled defense attorneys would struggle to create reasonable doubt. The trial lasted 4 grueling months and became a media sensation that captivated the entire country and sparked countless discussions about friendship, loyalty, and the dark potential that exists within ordinary people. 3 men in their late 50s, all of whom had built respectable lives, raised families, and contributed positively to their communities for decades, were suddenly revealed to be cold-blooded killers who had let their friend die to protect their own futures. The courthouse was packed every single day with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and members of the public who couldn't believe that such an elaborate deception had been maintained for so long. Daniel's family attended every day of the trial, finally learning the complete truth about what had happened to their beloved son and brother on that terrible night in 1998. The most devastating and emotionally wrenching testimony came from Brett Harrison, who had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his complete cooperation with prosecutors. For the first time in 27 years, he told the absolute truth about that night in the Utah mountains, explaining in excruciating detail how the three of them had covered up Daniel's death and maintained their conspiracy for nearly 3 decades. "We told ourselves we were protecting our families," Harrison testified, tears streaming down his face as he finally faced Daniel's family for the first time since the murder, his voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine after years of carefully maintained deception. "But the truth is, we were just protecting ourselves. Daniel would have done anything to help either of us, would have given us his last dollar, would have risked his own life to save ours. And when he needed us most, when he was dying, and we could have saved him, we chose to let him die." The courtroom was completely silent as Harrison described the methodical, systematic way they had erased Daniel from existence, how they had rehearsed their lies during the long drive home, how they had looked Daniel's devastated parents directly in the eye and pretended to help search for their missing son while knowing exactly where his body lay, buried in the Utah wilderness. He detailed the sleepless nights, the constant fear of discovery, the way their shared guilt had slowly destroyed their friendship over the years until they could barely stand to be in the same room together. He described the marriages and children and careers they had built on the foundation of Daniel's grave, the community respect they had earned while living as murderers. Marcus Webb and Jake Morrison showed absolutely no remorse during the entire trial, their expensive defense attorneys arguing that Daniel's death had been a tragic accident, that the cover-up had been a panicked decision made by young men who were terrified and drunk and not thinking clearly. They claimed that fear, not malice, had driven their actions, that they had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. But the jury saw through their carefully crafted excuses and self-serving justifications. The videotape evidence was simply too clear, too damning, too obviously calculated to support any claim of panic or accident. The systematic nature of their cover-up, the lies they had maintained for 27 years, the complete lack of any attempt to save Daniel's life, all of it painted a picture of men who had chosen their own self-preservation over their friend's life, without a moment's genuine hesitation. The prosecution presented a timeline that showed Marcus and Jake had nearly an hour to save Daniel's life, plenty of time to load him into their truck and drive toward medical help. Expert medical testimony confirmed that Daniel could very likely have survived his injuries if he had received proper treatment, that his death was not the inevitable result of his fall, but the direct consequence of their decision to abandon him. Marcus Webb and Jake Morrison were each sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, their comfortable lives and successful careers ending in the most dramatic and complete way possible. Brett Harrison received 15 years for his cooperation, but the weight of his crime and his role in Daniel's death would follow him for the rest of his life, a burden that no reduced sentence could ever truly alleviate. Daniel Cross's family finally had the answers they had been seeking for 27 long years. Years. But those answers brought a pain that was different from, and perhaps even worse than, the uncertainty and not knowing they had lived with for so long. The truth was more horrific than anything they could have imagined during all those years of wondering what had happened to their beloved Daniel. Daniel died believing that these men were his closest friends in the world, his sister Rachel said during her victim impact statement, her voice steady and strong, despite the tears streaming down her face as she addressed the court and the killers who had destroyed her family. He organized annual trips for them, celebrated their successes as if they were his own, offered to help them through their difficult times without expecting anything in return. He trusted them completely, loved them like brothers, And when he was lying in that ravine dying, they stood around discussing whether his life was worth saving. That betrayal, that complete and utter betrayal of everything friendship should mean, is something our family will never understand, never accept, and never forgive. The case made national headlines for months, becoming a cautionary tale that sparked intense discussions about the nature of friendship, the corrupting power of self-interest, and how quickly even the strongest relationships can turn deadly when alcohol, jealousy, fear, and moral cowardice combine in the perfect storm of circumstances. The story was covered by every major news network, spawned multiple documentaries and true crime podcasts, and became required reading in criminal justice courses across the country. It challenged people's assumptions about friendship and loyalty, forcing them to confront uncomfortable questions about what they might do in similar circumstances when their own futures were at stake. The eco-resort development was significantly scaled back out of respect for Daniel's memory and the wishes of his family. The specific area where he had been buried and murdered was permanently preserved as protected wilderness, ensuring that the land where he had died would remain untouched by commercial development forever. A small but beautiful monument was erected at a scenic overlook near the original campsite, honoring not just Daniel Cross, but all victims of violent crime whose cases had remained unsolved for years or decades, whose families had lived with uncertainty and unanswered questions, whose killers had walked free while justice waited for the right moment to emerge. Brett Harrison's decision to hide that videotape instead of destroying it as ordered had ensured that justice would eventually prevail, even if it took 27 years to emerge from the Utah mountains. His inability to completely destroy the evidence of their crime, driven by some combination of guilt, fear, and perhaps a subconscious desire for eventual accountability, became the instrument of their ultimate downfall. The story of Daniel Cross proves several uncomfortable but undeniable truths about human nature and the world we live in. There truly is no such thing as a perfect murder, no matter how carefully planned, how methodically executed, or how long it remains hidden from view. Eventually, somehow, the truth finds a way to surface, whether through advancing technology, changing circumstances, or the simple passage of time that brings new opportunities for discovery. There is no such thing as a secret that can stay buried forever, especially in an age of expanding development, improving forensic techniques, and the simple fact that the earth itself sometimes gives up what we try to hide within it. The mountains that seemed like the perfect place to conceal their crime ultimately became the stage for its exposure. And perhaps most painfully, most difficult to accept, there is no such thing as friendship that can truly survive the ultimate test of moral character, when self-preservation, fear, and the protection of one's own interests are placed in direct conflict with loyalty, love, and doing what's right. The bonds that seemed unbreakable, the brotherhood that appeared eternal, the trust that felt absolute, all of it crumbled in a single moment when tested by the most extreme circumstances. Daniel Cross died on July 18, 1998, believing completely in the power of brotherhood, surrounded by men he considered his closest friends in the world, never knowing that those same men would choose to let him die rather than risk their own consequences. He went to his grave with faith intact in the very people who were actively betraying him in his final moments. Those 47 seconds of footage that Brett Harrison tried to hide became the 47 seconds that exposed 27 years of lies, deception, and carefully maintained silence. The evidence he thought he was preserving for his own protection ultimately became the key to bringing justice to a man who deserved so much better from the people he loved and trusted most in the world. Sometimes the evidence we need most desperately is buried right beneath our feet, waiting patiently for the right moment, the right technology, in the right circumstances to bring the truth back to the light of day. And sometimes justice takes nearly 3 decades to arrive, moving slowly but inexorably forward until it finally reaches those who thought they had escaped accountability forever. The motorcycle was supposed to stay buried forever in that remote Utah forest. 3 friends believed with absolute certainty that they had committed the perfect crime, that their secret would die with them, that Daniel Cross would remain just another missing person whose fate would never be known. But Daniel Cross's story reminds us that the truth has a way of surviving even when everything else turns to dust. and that the people we trust most completely are sometimes capable of the most unthinkable and unforgivable betrayals. In the end, 47 seconds of hidden footage became 27 years of justice delayed, but ultimately not denied. Daniel Cross finally received the justice he deserved, his family finally learned the truth they had sought for so long, and two men learned the hardest lesson of all, that some secrets are simply too heavy to carry forever, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually claw its way back to the surface and demand its reckoning.